Sup VideoFort Nation, this is Chris Carter, the CEO of VideoFort and author of Become a Content Brand. Super quick message, this book is out now, it is awesome. There's some really great stories in there, stories about how when our director was kidnapped by Jamaican drug lords to working with some of the largest brands in the world. So I'd really appreciate it if you check it out. There's a link in the description below. And now to VideoFort Don for that awesome Retrowave loop tutorial.
Hi, this is Don and welcome to a new series of tutorial that I have recorded for VideoFort. Anyway, today we are going to start in After Effects. We are going to be creating a retro looped animated scene. So let's just jump in and take a look at what we are going to be building today. Okay, so this one should be quite interesting. Let me show you the final result. It's this Retrowave kind of scene, and I used Element 3D to construct the scene, and I'm going to be going over how to do this today and how to synchronize it to the music and so on. The first part of this was actually done in Cinema 4D. As you can see here, this is that landscape you see in After Effects. So I will provide this for you guys to download so you can follow along with the tutorial. However, if you are also interested in how to make this kind of thing in the first place, then I will attach a section at the end of this video showing you how I initially built these objects and then used them in Element 3D to construct the actual look and visual. Okay, so that's what we're gonna do now. Anyway, let's start with a new comp, which I have already created here. I'm gonna go for 1280 by 720, so not full HD, just so we can have a faster preview, and 30 FPS and 12 seconds duration. Okay, so I've already inserted a solid layer here. This is going to be our Element 3D layer, so Video Copilot and Element. And if I go to Scene Setup, we want to import that Objects C4D file. So let's just open this, and the force alignment, I'm gonna take this from the model because I don't want to mess that up. I already aligned this in Cinema 4D before. Okay, this is going to be in group number 1. That's fine. This material though, I don't need any specular on this. So if I go into the floor and landscape material, I will turn off the specular altogether, so just slide this all the way down. Doesn't seem to really change much, so I will change the type from physical shader to the old standard method, and now we get the pure black effect like this, and we can completely turn off the specular. Okay, there we go. Takes a few clicks, but once you do it, it's quite straightforward. I'm also making sure the color is fully black for this, just for the visual style that we are going for. Okay, so this is going to be our starting point for this. All right, and in Element is, you know, when you first load this up, it's just gonna look like this here. Our camera is sort of in the wrong place, really. So let's fix that. If I get a new camera, the focal length I'm gonna use is 24, and I'm gonna get a null object. Let's make this null 3D, and I will attach my camera to this, and this is the kind of camera setup I always have. So that I can move the null itself and then it just carries the camera with it. Okay, let's just make sure that things are lining up here. If I go to the position of the null, I'm going to raise this in Y space. So I will set this to maybe 0 or something. So we have this over here. And actually, you know what? I'm going to go for 1920 by 1080 because I've realized the numbers I'm using are different to the practice run I did for this. So that might throw me off. So if I just reset this to 1920 by 1080, I knew I was using a null position of 800, and now this matches what I had before. So my camera here, I'm gonna zero out the position also, and I also wanna untick or disable the auto orient feature. So if I go to transform, auto orient, and let's just switch this off. Okay, so we have what you might call our starting point, and of course in the final version here, you know, the camera is flying through these endless landscapes. So to do this, we need to go to our element 3D layer, and in group number 1, we want to use the particle replicator. And this is how we clone this into Z space so we can fly through it throughout the animation. So I'm going to try and remember the settings I used before. I think the replicator shape, I had to set this to, let's see, 3D grid. And there was only 1 in X and 1 in Y. But I think into Z space I had 6, and you can see right now they are all just overlaid onto each other, so this is not very useful right now. I'm going to get another camera. Let's call this camera number 2, and also 24mm. This is one I'm just going to use to look around the scene, just so we can get a clearer picture of what's going on here. So you can see they're overlaid on top of each other. We need them to go into Z space that way. So just because of how this worked out when I did the testing, for these to line up perfectly edge to edge, I need to set the, I think it's the shape scale to 6000, I believe. So let's try that. And when I do that, now you can see it lines up perfectly. This seems to correspond to the number of clones I have in the grid Z. So if I drop this to 4, for example, now you see this is too large. So we would need to drop this value down. And in this case, if I went for 4000, you can see it lines up perfectly again. If I make it slightly larger, you end up seeing where the gaps are. So let's again switch this back to 6, and the shape scale, I will set this to 6000. Now this just happened to work out for me here. You might be dealing with different scales if you started your scene completely from scratch and built something which looks different. But the idea is very simple. This number here needs to be something where the shapes you are using end up you know, merging edge to edge with no gap in between, and they don't overlap. Okay, so enough about that. Let's look through our main camera again. This is going to be camera number 1, and I will call this the free roam camera. So looking through camera number 1, now if I take this null and move it through the 3D world, you can see, you know, we would now be flying through this basically. So we need to start at the edge of the first block or the first landscape, and the animation moves through just 2 of their landscapes, and I'm going to show you how the looping works. So for me to set this up, I need to go into the top view so we can get an aerial view like this, and we kind of really have to zoom all the way out before this becomes useful. And I can kind of see the borders here where these blocks join up. All right, you get the idea now. This is right in the middle right now. It needs to be all the way over here or this other side. So I think it's this other side. I'm gonna take this null and move it back in Z space. And from the tests I did, I came up with 62,500, minus 62,500, right? And that put the camera in the exact spot it needed to be. And I'm trying to zoom back in quickly here. It's gonna take a few clicks. And again, depending on the size of your scene and the scale or numbers you are working with, this might be different, but the idea is very simple. You just need to position your camera at the beginning of the landscape, just like this, over here somewhere. So I would just need to find out what that number needs to be in order for this to work. And in this case, actually, it happens to be exactly minus 50,000, and that would be my starting point. So you get the idea. Okay, if we zoom out again here, like I said, the camera needs to fly through at least 2 of these blocks. So right now, this is the edge of the first one. Let's set the keyframe for the positioning on the null. And when I was doing some tests, the starting point of the third block, which at that point the camera would have traveled through 2 of these, it came up to be minus 12,500. So just to show you, this lines up with this more defined line you see here, and that's the edge of the third block here. So we've got sort of, you know, 1 here, and then 2, and then the third one starts there, and then 4, 5, 6, and that's the last one. Okay, so just line things up and move on to the next thing, which in this case, if I jump back into camera number 1, we can oh, I don't know why it changed, but let's look through that again. We can now preview the motion, and you will see that the camera just flies through, and it's looped. And it's very easy what's going on here, or very simple to explain. What the camera is looking at frame 0 is exactly the same as what the camera is looking at the end here. So visually, you know, the animation ends here and just jumps back to the beginning, and it appears looped. And for the record, what the camera is looking at halfway through the animation is also exactly the same as what we saw at the beginning there. So this is traveling through the first block, and then at 6 seconds we cross through onto the second one, and then at the end here we're looking at the third block, and of course we have more in the distance there. And because of the way this is set up, it just loops perfectly, and there are no glitches or anything like that. And the reason why, by the way, I flew through 2 instead of, you know, 1 or 3, that's just the speed which I liked. In this case, I could just fly through 1, So I would make a note of whatever the value is here, set a keyframe, and then let's say move that to the end. So now we're just flying through one section, and you can see it's half the speed of what we had before. So this is just down to personal preference. You could run through 3 instead and make it even faster. It's just up to you. Okay, so we have the camera motion. I want to show you something which is going on sort of at the end of the scene here. If I zoom in, you can see Element 3D has some near or far clipping, which means as the camera gets closer, that's when the geometry gets revealed. In this case, it's not really a big issue at all. In fact, by the time we apply all the other things in the scene, such as the glitching effects and other elements, you won't really even see what's going on over there. But if it bothers you, you can go to the render settings, and I think there is a camera cutoff control here. It's set to 50,000 units. So if we increase this to say 100,000, and that should be fine for this particular scene. Okay, so we have the landscape. We need to just kind of change where the camera is looking though. And this is the reason I put my camera inside of a null, because I can control the position using the null and the orientation on the camera itself. So in this case, I want to look up a bit. So if I go to the X rotation here, set this to 11 degrees, this is what I was working with in the original example. And here we go. This gives me more space to put the sun over there, which by the way is just a rendered image from Cinema 4D. So if I put this in a comp by itself, this is it right here. I can come back here and let's put this below the Element 3D layer, and you can size this however you want. You don't have to go with the scale, which I am going with here, which is 35%, and then I also moved it up in Z space like this. I think my scene might be slightly different to the old one. Yeah, I clearly have a lot more space in this scene here, so let's take a look at what might be different. And I'm not really sure why, but the zoom here is different. So 1 to 80. I think that's a wider camera. I'm actually not sure. That might be 28 mil. Let's see. So 24 gave us that. What if we go for 28? Okay, I'm not really sure what's going on here, but anyway, this seems to be closer to the example now. I have more space to move the sun up or down. I'm gonna move it down here. Okay, not really a big issue, just a slightly different look. Okay, moving on. Let's see what element we can do here. We have this blue fog in the distance there. We want to do the same thing. And now if I look at this and the main one, you can see they match up perfectly. Okay. Yeah, so the fog, this is in the element 3D, of course. So if I go here, let's enable the fog. And it's going to be that blue color, so 200 in the hue, and you can see it looks a bit crazy here, so we need to make some adjustments. For the opacity, I think I will go for something like 60. The problem here is just the distancing that we have going on here. if I go to the fog range, we need to bump this way up. So let me go for 60,000 or 62,500, which is, if you remember, that number came up before. And it gives me this, still too blue up here. So let's change the fall off type from linear to exponential, and this should push the fog into the distance. Something like this should be fine, and maybe lower the opacity back down to 50. And if we look at our example again, you can see we have the fog on the landscape, but then also kind of on the horizon. You can see it on the edges here, and also in front of the sun. So let's do that here too. This was done with a solid layer, and I used the gradient effect, so generate and gradient ramp. Let's set the end color to the same tone of blue. This layer will be set to add the blending mode, and it needs to be, let's see, behind the element 3D layer. So now we have this sort of fog on the horizon effect going on as well. We want to move the black point down and the blue point up to somewhere like this over here, and just fine-tune this until it looks right. You don't want it too high because it colors the sky. You just want it enough to give us that extra depth kind of effect. And there we go. Fairly simple there too. Okay, let's make the stars background. So I'm going to create a new comp. Let me just check the specifications of this comp over here. So 3560, the width should be the same for the height, really. So I'm gonna create a new solid here. Let's go for 3560 by 3560. I'm going to pre-compose, and let's leave the attributes so this maintains the same scale. We can now go in here, and on our solid, let's get a noise. So noise and grain and noise. Oops, no, that's totally wrong. I want fractal noise. So let's see, noise and grain and fractal noise. Okay. In the transform, the scale needs to be 5, and in contrast, let's set this to 500 and set the brightness to -150. And it's that simple. That's how you get the stars in the background effect. You can tweak this to try and have more or less stars. In this case, 400 gives me this kind of look here. All right, that's quite simple, not really that complex. Let's call this stars comp 2. And if we go back to our main comp, which I will call main new, okay, this needs to be behind the element 3D layer, of course, and the sun layer, actually behind everything. So we have this going on. The animation for this is straightforward. Just bring up rotation, set the keyframe at the beginning, go to the end, and set this to 360. And it just rotates around slowly like this. Okay, moving on. Let's see what element needs to be made next. I guess at this point, this is where we would start doing the synchronization to the beat of the music. Now, if I go back to this comp, let me also quickly just color my sky there. If I go to Effect, Color Correction, I will go and tint this And if I go to the blacks, I will just put this kind of purple color into this here, just slightly. Oops, don't know what I did there, but here we go. So now we have a similar kind of look to the example. Okay, let's do some of this animation. Now we are trying to synchronize some things, and actually I've noticed this is rotating at the wrong point. We need to move the center point to the edge of the horizon. So here we go. That's why this needs to be such a large layer, so it covers the whole background. Anyway, this is my soundtrack, and this is a free to use as long as you give credit to the original artist, so it's royalty free and will not be flagged by YouTube for copyright. But please refer to the original terms and conditions for this. And I'm just playing it through there, and this is something you'll have to do as well to figure out the beats per minute. Now, if you know that already, then you can skip this section, but let's say you are not sure. You can play the track in the background, and then you want to go to this website here called beats per minute, or tap for beats per minute. And it's as simple as it sounds. You would just start tapping on your keyboard to the beat, and then it will give you the correct number here. So this is kind of distracting me as I'm talking. Let's go back here, but you would just start tapping to the beat of your track, and it gives you an average beats per minute at a nearest whole. So if these two line up pretty well, then you know you have the right tempo. Anyway, when you have this information, there is a second website which will then tell you how far apart you need to place your keyframes in order for them to match the beat. So in this case, my comp is at 30 frames per second. The frames per, or rather the beats per minute, when I was trying this out before, was 116. So if I solve for this, it gives me a frames per beat of 15.5. Now that's a really awkward number, which means that we're gonna have to do a few things in After Effects in order for this to work. We'll actually have to do this manually and count the number of frames. But you know, the loop is 12 seconds, so really it won't be too much work. But sometimes you get lucky and end up with numbers which just match up perfectly. So for example, a common beats per minute is 120, and if you had a 24 FPS animation, this would work out perfectly to 12 frames per beat. And you know, that's very easy. That's 2 beats every second in this case. And again, if you had another 120 beats per minute song at 30 FPS, that would come in at 15 frames per beat. But we don't have that luxury in this case, so we have to deal with what we have. So 116, solve, and this is the number it spits out. Okay, so what I did with this was I went to my calculator. Let me reset. You can see I had some previous calculations, and you know, paste this here and then add it to itself. But let's make a note of this first number here, which is 15.5. In After Effects, I'm gonna go to my comp settings here, and I want to start the time code at frame number 1 instead of frame 0. That's always a bit confusing for me because frame 0 counts as a frame, but it's denoted as 0. So I set it to 1 so that it just makes a bit more sense. Okay, Now I can go to frame 15.5, which of course we can't do in this case. So the nearest whole would be, if you're rounding up, that would be frame 16. So if I go to my sun, I'm gonna animate the scale to just slightly get larger, and that's how I did that's the animation I did to match the beat of the track. So if I set a keyframe, I'm gonna move forward 4 frames. So pressing page down on the keyboard, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I set this to 36. So not a large movement. You know, if you want to exaggerate this, you can go for a higher number. But for me, just a subtle animation like this should be fine. So if I play that back, you know, it's very minor. Okay, and the center keyframe here is what needs to line up with frame 16, not the beginning of the animation here. So let's take these 3 and place them there. So adding that interval to itself, we get the second keyframe, which in this case would be 31.03. The nearest whole is 31 if you are rounding to the nearest whole number. And I will copy these, paste them here, and then move the center keyframe to the right spot. So we would now have 2 beats. And you get the idea. If I press equals again, we get 46.55. The nearest whole is 47. And this is something you would just have to do if you want the perfect result. And I know this isn't the most sophisticated way to do this, but in this case for me it works quite well. So hey, you know, if there's a better method of doing this, you know, when the keyframes don't line up into some nice easy numbers, then you know, do that instead. But for me, you know, with these odd numbers, I just kind of have to do this manually. So the next one here would be 109. That's the nearest whole frame. And once you have 8, you know, or an even a higher number, you can copy this, right? And if we move on to the next interval, in this case it's 139.6, so that's 140. If you copy 8 bars like this, the error threshold decreases because it's less likely to fall out of sync if you have the keyframe data is based on, you know, 8 whole bars. So at this point you can speed things up for yourself and calculate it that way. And then at the end here, to fill out the rest, I'm going to work out the gap between these 2 points here. In fact, I know it's, you know, what, 15.5. So if I move forward 15 frames, so jump 10, press shift and page down, that's 10, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to get the 15 point. It's 15.5, so let's go for 16, and I will paste that here and move it to the right point. And look at this, it lines up perfectly with the end of my animation. Now if your soundtrack doesn't do that, it's very easy to deal with this. In fact, I actually had to do that in my original version of this. If you look here, this is only goes up to what, 10.5 seconds. That's because I started with a different track which fit up to this point. And the way you calculate how it fits is you need to always use a number of bars which is a multiple of 4. So in this case we have 32 beats, you know, divide that by 4, you get 8. So this works out fine. You couldn't, for example, have 10, because you divide 10 by 4, you get 2.5. You would not be able to get this to work as well. In this case, because I started with the right track from the beginning, this fits nicely into 12 seconds. And also the last keyframe here is being cut off, but this is not a problem because the first and last keyframe of your animation are identical. So you actually want to cut that last one off in order to not have a repeated frame, which would throw off the synchronization the more and more you play or tile the loop end to end. So in this case, this is actually a good thing. I will, however, just move this back by 1, and let's cut off that end keyframe. So if I set that as my endpoint and trim comp to work area, this is now our new duration. So exactly 12 seconds. And I played that through. This is what we have, and I can take the music here, place this below, and this should just be synchronized now. So I'm gonna play. And in this case, it jumps back to the beginning, you know. So of course, we are only making a 12-second segment here. You know, you do everything else, you finish this, you output this, just a 12-second loop. And then what I do is I take that into my editing software, which in this case is Adobe Premiere. You know, put the loop end to end and as many times as I need it to loop. And then that's how I end up with the longer sequences. But right now we're just interested in making the perfect looped section. Okay, so that's part 1 of the animation. The other thing which was going on was, if we go back to this, the landscape here is changing color throughout. It, you know, the floor and the landscape are alternating in glowing brighter than their default state. So this was also quite simple. I took the element 3D layer, made a copy, went back in here, and we need to first of all just enable the blue color. So let's turn off purple in this case and set the blending mode of this layer to add. And you see it multiplies itself on top of our original E3D layer. We don't need the fog though, so let's turn this off. Just the edges like this. I can also maybe put a bit of glow onto this. I will use the element 3D glow. Turn the intensity down to maybe 0.25 or something, and then the radius to 1. But just makes it a bit brighter. And for the other color, again, make a duplicate of this. Come back in here, turn off blue, and keep purple this time. And now you see the floor is a bit more lit up before. And the animation for this is to alternate these two turning on and off. So I will first of all deal with the blue layer. This starts at in the middle of the beat of the sun here. This is how you line this up. So first of all, let's call this blue and purple. Although I think it's more like pink really, but doesn't matter. If I go to the opacity this time instead of scale, I will set a keyframe for this to turn off. So 100%, move forward 1 frame, and now it's off. And then at this other section, we turn it back on. Okay, and it's that simple. So now I can copy these 2 keyframes and paste them again. So we start off, on, off, on, off, on, and then keep doing that. This will be easier to deal with because we've already synchronized, so we are not redoing those calculations, just making sure that things line up. Okay, at this point I realized I made a mistake earlier in the video when I said that I would end up with 32 beats. It's actually only supposed to have been 24 because, you know, the first group of 8, which I copied 3 times, which, you know, 3 times 8 is 24, not 32, except you know, the 24th beat actually would have been outside of the range of my timeline here. So there's 23 here if you count these, which means we are going to drop down to 20. 20 is a multiple of 4, so this would loop fine for us. So if I get rid of the last 3 here and move my the end of my animation, press N on the keyboard to set this as the end. And of course, and remember, you are always cutting off the actual last frame because that is the same as the first frame in your animation. So this means I need to get my camera animation and move it back to this 20th beat, which by the way ends up being the same as the example I showed you in the beginning, 10.5 seconds. I could have added an extra 12 frames over here. That would have also fixed the issue, but I prefer a slightly faster animation, so I dropped down to 20 frames. 20 beats rather, instead of 24 in this direction. Anyway, and in this section now we can see that the landscape turning on and off is going to loop perfectly now. Okay, so we will take these same keyframes, go to the purple layer and go to the very beginning here, bring up the opacity as well, and paste that there. So these will be offset from each other by a single beat, which means when one turns on, the other one turns off, just like this. There is a slight overlay right now. I think it's a single frame overlay. So what I can do is maybe push this one back this way, or take this one and push it in that direction. And now if I play this through, you can see that it is synchronized to the beat. This is a bit different though to the original because the landscape turning on and off is twice as fast. It should have been every other beat here instead of on every beat, but just gives us a slightly different result, which also works in this case. Anyway, as far as animation goes, that's all we need to do. Now we just want to do the sort of overlay effects to make this look a bit prettier than it does right now. So one of the things I did was I took the sun and just put some blur on this, so fast box blur, and I think the radius was set to 20, and I set the blending mode of this layer to add, just so it blends in a bit with the background, just to give the sun a slightly diffused kind of look. And I'm going to trim my composition here. We don't need anything on the outside of this. And the next thing was to put some general glow on top of everything. So this was just a simple adjustment layer with the glow effect applied to it. So stylize and glow. I set the threshold to 100% and the radius to also be at 100, which gave me this really nice bright and glowing kind of look. This will look different if you are working in a different bit depth, so make sure you are using the same, and I think in 32 it's gonna look pretty crazy. So this is based on 8 or 16 bit in this example. And then on top of all the glow effects, we of course have the glitch effects that we see in this example, this sort of bad TV or VHS kind of overlay. Now this was actually generated using some free stock VHS stock which I found, so I will link that as well. But it's these two clips. So this is going to be the overlay on top. And then this other one here, I used this to generate the distortion because it has this really interesting white glitches and white lines going across the screen. So if I show you the pre-comp of the glitch layer, I just cut out a section where there was some of these lines going down and flashing on and off the screen. I think the original clip is quite long, something like 40 minutes. So there's plenty in there to cut a section for you which fits your scene. Okay, anyway, I put this into a pre-composition like this and cut it to be the same length as my main animation, which in this case is at 10.5 seconds. And then if we come back in here and I take this layer, we don't need to see it. So let's turn it off. And then I'm going to take a adjustment layer and use the displacement map effect. And the displacement layer is going to be our VHS glitch layer. And then for the displacement horizontal and vertical, I just changed this to luminance rather than the color channels. And then the displacement, I think I set this to something like 20, which is going to start playing with your frame and displace it around. And as I play this through now, you can see the glitches take place, and it just creates a bit of visual interest, and you know, it adds to the whole old school retro kind of style. So you could maybe stack these if you want more glitches, or use a part of the clip which is more glitchy, but for this example this will work just fine. All right, so that's the first glitch. The other one, we will take everything and pre-comp it. So if I just take all of this, pre-comp, let's call it main pre 2, and click OK. Don't know what's going on here. It seems to have lost all of my camera data, or rather it's using the free roam camera as my point of view. So let's jump out and go back to this level, and here we go. All right, and this section is even simpler. Just take the other VHS stock. I also put this into a pre-comp by itself. This one is a much shorter clip, and it's mostly just these white lines, and then at one point at the beginning you have these other lines going down like this. So very simple there. I can take this and overlay it over my main sequence and just scale this to cover the whole frame, and set the blending mode to screen. So we have the distortion. So we have the distortion in the main comp, and then on top of that we have these white scan lines going over the top. So that looks pretty good right there. The other thing going on here is the Rgb Split Effect, and I did this manually, but if you have a plugin like Magic Bullet Looks, then you just turn that on and add the Rgb splitting effect. But if you don't, it's also quite easy to do. Just go to Effects, Color Correction, or rather Channel, and Set Channels. And what we want to do here is separate the 3 color channels into 3 separate layers. So here, starting with red, leave that as it is, but turn green off, and let's see, green as well. So now we can, no, blue and green, yeah, turn those off, and we're now just left with red. I can duplicate this time turn red off and blue, and turn on green. So you get the idea basically, and then this time turn on blue only. So those are the 3 separate layers, and if you just add them on top of each other, you end up with your original image. But what's cool now is you can take the 3 layers and offset their position or scale to create the Rgb split effect. So if I go for 101 for the scale on the green layer and 102 for the other layer, we now end up with this slight offset, which creates the Rgb split effect. And because of the way this works, the effect is more obvious around the edges if you use the scale method. And this is where we end up, and at this point we are basically finished. I would just take the 2 layers above though, make them a child of the first layer, just so I can scale past these kind of weird edges here, although this might kind of add to the effect in some weird way, because the whole thing does look very glitchy and offset. Anyway, also our displacement map layer kind of shifted everything in one direction here. You can see this is not perfectly centered, so I would maybe just move that here as well, which means you might have to scale up a bit more, but in this case that's all I needed to do there, not much else. I can take another adjustment layer, go to color correction, and I'm going to use a curves adjustment just to fade everything slightly to something like this here, and that's it. If we play this through, we can see our finished scene, and that is how you would go about making a Retrowave scene using Element 3D and a bit of Cinema 4D as well. Now, I did say I was going to quickly talk about how to construct this kind of geometry, so let me do that now. In Cinema 4D, this is the old objects scene here. This is actually very simple, but you didn't need to, watch this section. If you just downloaded these files, you would have been able to follow along with the tutorial. Anyway, so in a new scene, I'm gonna start with a plane, and I'm gonna have a width of 10,000 and a height of 10,000 as well. The width and height segments are going to be 100 and 100, so just something like this here. And the way to do the landscape effect is to use what's called the displacer deformer, and this is the deformers menu over here. So let's grab one of these, put this under the plane, and then in the shading tab, we want to load up a noise map. So open this and noise. You might see a slight different, but there isn't enough strength. So if we go back to the displacer, set the height here to be 1000, and now you will see some stuff happening. But it's the wrong type of noise, so we need to change this to something else. And the preset I used is called fire. Now everything is going to disappear because we need to change our space here. Let's go for UV 2D, and hopefully as I do this, you can start to see the resemblance between this and the version we had in Element 3D. Now you can see this is below the surface here. It needs to be above. So this just means going back to the deformer in the object tab, change the type from intensity centered to just intensity, and then everything is going to happen above the floor plane, just like this here. Okay, if we come back into this, I'm going to go to the high clip and bring this to about 50%, just to make these mountains a bit taller. And now you would just adjust this until you get the kind of look that you want, but you can change the seed to get a different randomized look. You can play with the scale and so on, just to see what you can come up with. I think in my example, I also had a height of 1500 instead of 1000, just to make it taller. Okay, so that's making the landscape. We need to make an opening or a valley kind of effect in the center there. So I'm gonna go to my shading again in the deformer tab. Let's open this and put the noise map into a layer. So now we can stack things on top of each other. And what I need here is a gradient, and it's gonna look a bit strange. Just don't worry about that for now. Let's put black in the middle and white on both sides like this, and I'm gonna right click and distribute the knots to make sure that everything is equally spaced out. And the idea here is we need a bunch of these white points, so there are 5 on this side. Let's do the same over here. I'm just clicking and holding control to drag to copy what we have, and again distribute to make sure that this is perfectly centered like this. So there needs to be the same number either side for this to line up in the middle like this here. Okay, and then at this level set the blending mode to multiply, which means the black part is going to flatten the center of our scene here, and this is where our camera would be flying through this way. Okay, so it's that easy to make the outer landscape. I'm gonna make a copy of the plane, and let's call this our landscape, the one with the deformer on it, and the other one, let's just call this floor. Now the floor will need to be higher than our landscape here. So if I go to the height, I will set this to 20, just so we make sure we have flat ground above the two, the mountains here. Okay, and I would simply just create 2 materials, because this is how Element 3D separates the elements when you import them into After Effects. So one material is going to be the floor, which I should apply to the floor, and the other one is going to be the landscape, and apply that to the landscape like this. Maybe color code things to make it easier to see what's what, but here we go. Okay, so those lines you saw in cinema around the edges, that was also some geometry. And the way I generated that was using the atom array. Now I want to make the lines based on what they are attached to. So the landscape, if I first select this, I will take what's called an instance object, which just means copying something. So now we have 2 of these. And what's great is whatever I do to the original landscape, the instance will automatically update. So that's why I do it this way. But I can now also use the instance as a real object to generate the lines around the edges, and that's done using an atom array effect. So if I get this, put the landscape instance in here, and you will now see these lines appear. Perhaps it's not too visible, so let's go to constant shading, for example, and make a material. In the luminance, we will just make this one blue, because that was the color of the landscape edges. So this here, and apply it to the atom array, and now you can see how that would appear later in After Effects. Now there is some changes you can make here. If I go to constant shading with lines, I was working with a cylinder radius, which is the border or the edges here of 2, and a sphere radius, which is the joints of 2 as well. So the joints didn't appear basically, but maybe you want to be a bit more playful with this. Go for a higher radius to create this kind of jointed kind of look like this here. I also, because I didn't have the radius there, I just dropped the subdivisions to 3, because we don't need any more than that really, just to show some lines around the edges. Anyway, make a copy of the atom array there. Let's call the first one landscape edge, and the other one floor edge. But in the instance here, I will drop the floor and replace the landscape, so that now this atom array should be generating some lines for our floor. I think I put the wrong thing there. Let me see. I put the displacer instead of the floor. And when I do that, it should be generating some lines. And as you can see, it is, but the position is wrong. This should be set to 20, our instance here. Okay. The easiest thing to do is to select whatever you want to copy and instance that, because it will copy all the rotational data and positioning and so on. So now I can just drag this in here and it works the first time. The material for this would be a different color. Let's go for that pink. So something like 285 for the hue, and if this is applied to our floor edges, and now we have that section as well. And let me just make this black as well to represent what we had in After Effects. And here we are. There is one more thing which I nearly forgot, which is these need to be able to tile edge to edge as well without leaving any gaps or weird geometry. So the way this works is if I put everything into a null, and let me get another instance of this null, so we have a copy. If I move this back into Z space, you can see that, and it's 10,000 units here I need to set for the position. You can see that the edges don't line up the way they should. Let me go to growth shading. You can clearly see there's some strangeness going on here, and imagine the camera flying past this open section here. It would look very strange. So to fix this, we go back into the displacer. And this is the beauty about using instances, because you only need to update at the lowest level and everything will just work out automatically. So, you know, this instance updates the atom array instances, and then in turn that updates this other instance we have over here. Okay, to fix the edge issue, we just need another gradient layer. Set this one to 2D box and then flip the colors around so that black is around on the edges, and I will set the blending mode of this to multiply as well. So this is going to flatten the border areas of the geometry, so they will end up blending into each other like this. Now this is too crazy, too much flattening, so let's bring up the white point closer to the black until we just have the edge sewn up but not flattened too much. And now, you know, you won't be able to really see the edge as you fly by with your camera. And you know, that's it. That is the piece of geometry you would take into After Effects in order to use it with you know, to construct the scene in Element 3D. I think this as it is right here would import into Element 3D with no problems, but just in case you have some issues, you can right click this and current state to object, and what this would do is create a baked down version which you will no longer be able to customize, but it is you know, now an editable object. And I think you will be fine either way. You just need to make sure you apply the materials to the right places, and this kind of thing is exactly what I took into Element 3D at the beginning of the tutorial. Anyway, I hope you found that helpful, and hopefully if you want to start building your own scenes, then you will just have a much better idea than you might have had before. Anyway, thanks for watching. This was a really long one, but as always, you know, I enjoy doing this kind of thing, so it's not a big deal for me. Anyway, again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.